Hi there, I'm Eva Funderburgh. I am a sculptor in ceramics, bronze casting, and installation art, and I'm also an instructor at the Pratt Fine Arts Center in Seattle, Washington, and I'm going to film this little video to walk you through the process of making a plaster mold for casting wax. I mentioned the lost wax process, and just very briefly, that's the process of creating an original sculpture, or even anything that you have on hand, which we'll call the original positive, making a mold of some type of that positive. This is a rubber mold. Pouring wax into that mold to get a wax positive, and then eventually going through several steps that I'll gloss over here, at which point you get a bronze positive. Now, one of the options for mold making is plaster. And plaster is pretty darn great for it. It is quick, it is easy, it is cheap, and it's so much faster than a lot of the other steps. So I'm going to walk you through the hows and whys and why nots of making a plaster mold for casting wax. So plaster has a lot of advantages as a mold making material for casting wax. And they mostly come down to it's really quick, it's really easy, and it's really cheap. And to compare this to like some of your other options, for this is a silicone rubber mold, a commercial one that's pour-on, and I probably had to wait, I don't know, 6 hours before I could cast wax in this. And I also probably spent about $20 on this rubber. Here's a larger mold. It is the first front half of an antelope. And even this I cobbled together out of hardware silicone caulk. And even that's like $12 worth of material. But even with that rubber mold, I still have to make a plaster mold, a retaining shell that goes around the rubber mold to keep it from flopping around. Doing a plaster mold basically means you're skipping all of those steps. You're just doing one step, and it's pretty cheap. A 50-pound bag of plaster will maybe run $30 to $40. And it's pretty easy to obtain from local ceramic supply stores. So why would you not use plaster? Well, there's a whole stack of reasons there. It's got no flexibility at all. So if you have any piece with a lot of texture in it, a lot of surface area, it will grab onto that and refuse to release it from the mold. So this tree I have here, that I just took out of the rubber mold, this is out of wax now, would never come out of a plaster mold easily. It also doesn't have an extremely long lifespan as far as use as a mold. As the mold gets used, it degrades over time, and maybe I'd say you might get 5 really good waxes out of a plaster mold, 10. And this is compared to being able to get 20, 30, 100 good waxes out of a rubber mold. It's also not good on anything porous. Because it is applied as a slurry, anything porous, it will go into the pores of the material and just solidify, and then you can never pull it apart. It's not what you want. And last of all, there's the lack of flexibility. I might have said that already. Now, before I mentioned undercuts. Simply speaking, an undercut is just any bit of texture that would prevent a mold from being lifted straight off the positive. And if you have no undercuts, that's great. That means you can make a one-piece plaster mold. It's dead simple. Put the object down, you put the plaster on top. This is an example of a one-piece plaster mold I had sitting around. I made a bunch of leaves once in order to cast wax leaves that I then stuck onto a plant. You can see here, are all nice and simple. I can clean up that extra splashed wax later when that's going on. But I'm pretty sure making this mold took me about 20 minutes, 30 minutes. So you see here, this is a simple little sort of Monopoly house. It's got some texture, but it doesn't have undercuts. So I could use this as a one-piece plaster mold and be able to pull the house straight up. But what would happen if, looking at this, we decided it wanted eaves? Okay, we got the house, give it some eaves. Squish. Okay, it's a bit wonky, but now the house has eaves. This means that I could no longer pull the mold straight up. What can I do now? Simple. I can make two molds that each comes from each side. This will require a two-piece plaster mold. It's just like this mold that I showed you before with the wings. Get two, they fit together, you pour the wax in, it works out. But now, what if you wanted the house to have a door also? There we go, there's a door. Now you'd have to do a three-piece mold, so you have one part that comes off this way, one part this way, one part this way. You can see how the more complicated the shape, the more complicated the plaster mold's going to be. Finally, in looking around the house, I found the perfect thing for showing a plaster mold. Bottle of jet dry. And the reason why I would choose plaster to mold this if I was using it in a sculpture is it's an incredibly simple shape. It's got sharp planes that the plaster really likes to show off. Like, it's easy to keep those crisp. It's also mostly empty, and it only has a couple things that'll make life difficult for us as we do the plaster mold. And those are specifically the texture on the cap, which I bet the plaster would not want to release. And it's got an extra undercut here on the bottom. I'll talk more about those as we get closer to making the mold. So I'm going to use this to make a two-part plaster mold. It's going to divide like this. The two parts come off that way. Looking at it, the cap's a little bit of a problem. It's got really, really fine texture on it. And honestly, easiest way for me to deal with that, just smear some clay on it. It'll be fine. I don't particularly need that texture in my finished piece, and if I did, I could recreate it afterwards by just doing a little bit of carving. And while I'm doing that, I'm also smearing a little bit of clay under the lid to prevent the plaster from flowing up into that undercut. There we go. Now the other undercut on this sculpture, on this bottle, is the bottom of it. It's concave like this. If I tried to do a two-part mold, then the plaster would stick under here. And again, my finished bronze is going to be sitting like this. I don't care what the bottom of the bottle looks like. So I'm going to fill it up with clay. That's always the easiest way of dealing with undercuts, especially with plaster. If it's not something that's relevant to the sculpture, why bother? There we go. Now there's a few different ways you can divide a positive in half for mold making. If it is something where I was going to divide it in half like this, I just put flat on the board and I build a clay wall over the top. However, that's a little tricky with something that's this tall and this skinny. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to embed it in a wall of clay. We go. The bottle is embedded in the water-based clay. The clay goes halfway up and it's got a nice clean line where it meets the bottle. This is going to be one half of the mold, and then after this side has set, we'll flip it over, pull off the clay, make the second side. Down here, this is going to be the pour cup. This is going to be an opening in the mold that we eventually pour the wax through. I used water-based clay because that's what I have a lot of on hand. You can use oil-based clay just fine. The only downside is you often end up throwing out this clay because plaster gets in it. And water-based clay, a lot cheaper than oil-based clay. The last thing I need to do is to make some registration marks. The registration marks are just going to be little nubs here that will make sure the two molds fit together like puzzle pieces later on. I'm actually going to smooth them out with the sponge a little bit because they ended up mildly wonky. Can't have wonkiness. Okay, there we go. Now I'm ready for the plaster. Let me get my work area all set up for that, and then I'll talk you through what I have. So I have all of my supplies lined up and ready to go. I've got #1 pottery plaster. Don't use plaster of Paris because it's too weak. I have my tub of plaster. Plaster collects moisture from the environment, so therefore once you have it open, actually in general you really need to store it in plastic, in something that seals, and not directly on a concrete floor like that bag is. Once I open up the plaster, the first thing I end up doing always is checking for lumps. This plaster is old enough, it's starting to develop some, but it's not bad yet because they're still pretty soft. Those lumps are the plaster soaking up moisture from the environment and starting to set. And if there's enough lumps, the plaster won't work at all. And that's the #1 thing to check as you open your plaster, whether it's a new bag or a airtight, watertight tub that you've had sitting around for 6 months. Always check. This is my rinse bucket. Some people work plaster with gloves on. I don't because I like to feel the texture of the plaster as I'm going. But it's very important to have a bucket available to rinse the plaster off your hands. And then when you're done, let all the plaster settle out and never pour half-set plaster down the drain. Or any plaster down the drain. This is the bucket I'm going to be using for mixing the plaster in. I've just eyeballed it. You end up with about 50% more plaster than you have with the water that you start with. So looking at this right now, I probably have a little bit more water than I need. But better too much than too little. I have my positive. It's totally ready to go. It's got the sprue cup. It has not been sealed, but I don't need to seal it. If this was any number of different things, anything less porous or anything more porous than this plastic we have here, I would seal it first with shellac, and then maybe even put mold release on it for good measure. Plaster's pretty forgiving, but I know for a fact that there's no need to worry about release with something that's so non-porous as this plastic bottle. And then finally, I have my respirator mask. Wearing a respirator mask or a dust mask is really important. I will be having this on as I go through most of the process, so I'll probably dub in instructions and explanation of what I'm doing later on. Okay, so what I just did is I sifted plaster in until there's an island that occupies about the middle half of the bucket. Note that it's still sticking around. What I'm doing now is I'm letting bubbles sift out of the plaster. This is something where if I was doing this for a ceramic mold, I would have been far, far more precise. I would have weighed that, I would have weighed this, everything would be exact and precise and scientific. I'm not doing that. So what I'm doing instead, I'm eyeballing it. It'll probably be right. If it's a little thick, it's a little thin. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter with wax. And that's pretty nice. Okay, so the plaster is set for about 2 minutes. Oftentimes I give it as long as 5, but since this plaster is old, I know that it's going to start setting up quickly. I never wear gloves while mixing plaster, just because it helps me to feel the texture of the plaster as I'm mixing it. Starting out, it sort of feels like cream, and then melted milkshake, and so forth. So this is starting to change in consistency a bit. Just the way that moves in the bucket. You can tell that means it's starting to set. So I'm actually going to scoop a little bit onto the bottle as sort of a face coat. I realize there is some clay stuck to it. That's no good. So the job of the face coat is to make sure it catches any little detail on the model. And the plaster's still flowing off the side now, but that's fine. I want it to be liquid enough to go in and catch all of the details. That's what I'm looking for right now. And then I am going to smack it with this and knock any bubbles off. There we go. So I'm looking to do a plaster mold that is about 1.5 inches thick, 1.5 to 2 inches. So plaster is really just a waiting game. You can't ever walk away from half set plaster because that's the only one guaranteed way of getting it to set. All you can do is keep stirring it and keep feeling it. It's going to slowly change with time, going from cream to melted milkshake to sour cream. And that can take 10 minutes, that can take 20 minutes, and the fresher the plaster, the longer it'll take. Okay, so I can tell that the plaster is starting to get ready to set. It's moving differently. It's no longer feeling like a melted milkshake. Now this is like the full-on stick in the straw milkshake. It's going to go from that to sour cream. And what I'm just looking to see is if it's still rolling around, because in just a sec here, I'm going to start scooping it on. It's at a point where it's still going to be flowing off the mold, but that doesn't matter. Since this is old plaster, I know that it's going to be setting fast. So once it starts to go, it's going to be going fast. Plaster goes through a bunch of stages. It goes through liquid, it goes to sort of a point where you can scoop it but still going to flow, and then pretty quickly it gets to sculptable, followed by carvable. And you don't want to miss the sculptable phase. So it's much better to put on too early than it is to put on too late. This is pretty spot on for the water. I wish I'd remembered how much I put in so I can do the other side with the same amount. Okay. So earlier I mentioned that you want the mold to be about 1.5 inches thick. Easiest way to check is just to stick your finger in. So I actually have a little bit more than I need. Still wants to move around a fair bit, but it's definitely starting to get sculptable. I'm using the clay wall as a guide of whether or not the mold is the right thickness, because I know where that is on the edges, and so it's a pretty useful benchmark. Might as well clean my bucket as everything starts to set. Can also pop off the plaster once it's set, but no time like the present. So plaster's pretty well set now. So I'm going to get my hand wet. There we go. And now let's give that like a bit of time to harden. It's going to start heating up. I don't want to take the other side off until it's done heating. Okay, this is getting pretty toasty. To get full strength, I need to wait for it to finish heating and then cool down again. But I'm impatient. And there we go. Hey look, it's a bottle of Jet Dry. There we go. Now, one of the first things I want to do, actually before it finishes setting, is to make sure it doesn't have any sharp edges on it. I've cut myself on plaster before, so it's really important to make sure it's not sharp. And I'm just making sure the edges aren't sharp and the spots where the mold connects with the positive are all nice and sharp. Because if they aren't, I'm gonna have a lot of cleaning up to do later on. I'm gonna get my pour spout made. Pour cup. There we go. So there's one really important step before going on. Mold soap. I mentioned before that if you try and use plaster on anything porous, the plaster is going to flow into those pores and it's going to stick. Well, you know what's porous? Plaster. So that's sort of obnoxious. Anytime you have plaster on plaster, you need to do something to keep it from sticking. Mold soap is the most tried and true option. However, if you don't have mold soap, you can get creative. I've used Vaseline before. I've heard of people using Pam, like the cooking spray. A little bit of cooking oil even. Mark Walker used to swear by used motor oil, but cooking spray, yeah. So let's get some mold soap on there. Getting it on there. And I'm also importantly getting it on the sides, because the plaster is not going to stay where you want it to stay. And better to acknowledge that and to be prepared. Mold soap you can get at the pottery supply store also. And actually both mold soap and I think some small bags of pottery plaster can be carried by some art supplies. However, if you have the ability / place to store it, it's always safer to get plaster in a 50-pound bag. Because when you subdivide it into smaller bags, you're getting moisture in there. You don't know how fresh it is. It's probably safer to stick with a 50-pound bag if you can afford / store it. Or even if you can't store it because like it'll go bad eventually, but watch out for the subdivided bag is what I'm saying. There we go. Now, again, if this is something where if I'm doing this for a ceramic mold, I have to be much more precise. I'd put this on, I'd let it dry, I'd buff it off. I'm not doing that. The mold doesn't care, it's gonna be fine. Okay, so I've refilled my water. Oop. So pour some on the counter. By tilting it, I'm sort of visualizing how much I have versus the space for the mold. I've got mold soap on. I've got my rinse bucket. I've got my plaster. I've got my respirator. Second verse, same as the first. We have a two-part mold. I'm gonna let it cool for a while and then come back to it tomorrow morning and crack it open.
The governor has renewed.
So I've let the mold rest overnight. That's absolutely not necessary. You just want to wait until both sides are cool to the touch. And honestly, I don't always do that just because I'm impatient. I will say trying to pour hot wax into a hot mold is gonna get you nowhere fast. But anyway, first I've got to crack it open. Scraping like this, make sure there's no plaster overlapping, and it exposes the seam between the two halves. I'll go around and scrape all the sides. Okay, let's see. Pop! We have a mold! Let's pop this out of here. I'll pop out the clay from the pour spout. And here we go. Got the two halves of the two-part mold. They fit together like this. And let's pour some wax in here. But before I do this, one very important note about pouring wax into plaster molds. Earlier, I mentioned the pores of the plaster. It is really important that as you pour hot wax into a mold, that the pores of the plaster are filled with water. Otherwise, the wax flows into those pores, and then you are never going to get your wax out of your mold, ever. In this case, since we just made this mold, it's really heavy with all the water that's embedded in it. It's gonna be fine. If it's a mold that hasn't been used in a while, soak it in water until bubbles stop coming up, and then your wax won't stick. Other than that, you don't need any mold release, anything like that. Let's give this a try. Okay, I have here a pot of wax from the wax pot. It's cooling down a little bit so it's not too hot. I've got my mold. Let's do this. I'm twisting it as I pour to make sure it coats all of the inside of the mold evenly. I'm going to let that cool for a few minutes and then repeat the process several times. I can't tell you exactly how many times you need to do that to get 3/8 of an inch of wax, which is what I'm looking for, because the number of times depends on the temperature of the wax and the temperature of the mold. If you pour the wax in when it's too hot, it's just going to melt off the wax that's already in there. Okay, third coat. I have some cold water that's soaking inside the mold to cool the wax down. So looking inside of it, I maybe have 3/8 of an inch coating the inside. Might be a little thin, but since I am eager to see how the mold came out, and honestly, I never use the first wax out of a mold anyway, that's the one that collects the crud. First wax always is mostly there just to tell you which directions you need to tilt the mold, what parts need to be cleaned more, and to give you information instead of being your finished sculpture. I'm gonna let this cool. I'm gonna pour some cold water in here, and then we're gonna open it up and see how it went. here we go. It's not the nicest pour of wax, but here we have one jet dry bottle made out of wax when it used to be made out of plastic. Thank you for watching this video on basic plaster mold making for casting wax. Thanks.